Peasants' Revolt. He did not become Anabaptist, but Conrad Grebel was in touch with him, consulting with him, and asking him about his violence, how he could justify that, and carried on a correspondence. So Thomas Müntzer did not become Anabaptist, but he was this close. Here are the 12 articles of the Christian Union of Upper Swabia. And you notice this is about Christian unity. All these were big issues that led to the Peasants' Revolt. And so here are the peasants saying, this is what we're about, and this is how we want to create our world. Oh, yeah, up to 12. Reasonable rents paid to lords, paid by lords, fair judgments in legal cases, common lands returned to peasants for common use, and hunting, forests for hunting were only for the nobles. The peasants had no rights there. And the end to Heriot, this is the privilege of nobles to demand horses and military equipment. And then notice the last one. If any of these can be proved to be unsupported by Scripture, they are null and void. The peasants wanted to hear the gospel and live out their lives accordingly, and those who could be considered enemies of the gospel were the enemies of the peasants. The idea of a pure gospel served as their justification. Okay, here's Thomas Müntzer on the 5-mark bill in Germany. It's 1975. I had a Uzbek/Russian who was going to write a history of Anabaptists and Mennonites leading up to the occupation of a village in 1884 that lasted until 1935, until they were deported. He introduced Anabaptists with Thomas Müntzer. That was his idea of somebody who could lead a revolution. Well, I said, I don't think this is going to work. And so he didn't finish it. But Thomas Müntzer is a big man, big idea in the history of the Peasants' War and in Germany. Then there was medieval mysticism. You can read what's on the screen. So this is about spirituality, inner piety, about living your convictions, forming them, first of all, in the image of Christ and with the teachings of Christ. And then that led to your living out. As Hans Denk is often quoted, no one can follow Christ truly unless you follow him in life daily. Okay, so here's where we've been. Erasmus, Ulrich Zwingli, the Benedictine Order, and the Schleitheim Brotherly Agreement, the Peasants' War, and medieval mysticism. What are your comments, questions, additions, corrections? You can always contradict me. I don't mind as long as you can prove what you're saying. If you have some evidence. I had a student in my peacemaking and justice class. I had them read a piece by a former lieutenant in the Army who was writing about the power of video games, how that helps recruit people for the military. Pretty amazing document. So when I asked my class what they thought of it, I had one guy who said, no, I don't agree. Do you have some evidence? It was an opinion. It wasn't evidence-based. So it really didn't count for much. Now you notice that most of the Anabaptist ideals were taught by Zwingli. Zwingli turned to the city council to manage the Reformation, and even Martin Luther thought governments had to lead reformations. The church wasn't capable. It's an odd thing for him to say, but his idea of biblical order was God, and then you had the church as the right hand of God, you had the state as the left hand of God. So it was a dualistic kind of paradigm. And he was sure that the church couldn't bring reform, although he launched it, but he thought the government should control it. Well, at the end of the Peasants' War, up to 100,000 peasants were slaughtered. About a third of the 300,000 peasants estimated to have been involved in the rebellion. And peasants all believed that Martin Luther was their champion. He had preached Reformation. He had preached liberation and freedom. So they were following his lead. But he had a very rigid idea of government. Government was the left hand of God, while the church was the right hand of God. So you couldn't separate the two. So you see why the Lutheran Reformation and the Zurich Reformation came out at different places, because they started at different places. Luther's worldview told him that the government has to be involved. So he never had the vision of a separate church, a pure church, a believer's church. Ulrich Zwingli taught that for a while, but he made a dramatic switch at the third debate. It was all about infant baptism versus adult baptism, or believer's baptism. And he switched, all of a sudden, to everybody's surprise, to advocating for infant baptism, after having taught the other since 1522. So it was a radical shift, totally unexpected, and it left the disciples, those who became Anabaptists, up a river, totally without support from Zwingli. Comments, questions?
What made him switch over?
Nobody knows.
It never was written down.
No. Even the new scholars, don't know. They both say it's a mystery. But one can extrapolate, one can guess that it had to do with the support of the government, the state. He didn't think the church could manage this reform. It had to be the state. Just like Luther said, it's the state that has to lead reforms. The church can't do it. Odd, I know. And of course, for the Anabaptists, it was inside out. Yes, we are going to reform the church. And the Anabaptist growth in Zolikon, Scheidegger calls the first church out of the Swiss Reformation. And so he recognizes it as Zurich's or Switzerland's best contributions to the world. First one was the Reformed Reformation. Second was the Anabaptist Church. He claims credit for both, says they both came out of Zurich, and we honor them both. So Scheidegger gives a much more positive view of Anabaptists than I expected. But given 500 years of history, they realized the significance of a believer's church without the support of a government. The separation of church and state. So this was a big deal, and historians are giving the Anabaptists credit for creating the first believer's church right out of Zurich. Questions, challenges? Yes?
Can I ask a question from your presentation this morning?
Yes.
I noticed your use of the word evangelical,
Yes.
which is a much vexed word in our present environment. What did it mean in the 16th century context?
Good question. It meant to be missionary-minded. It meant that this is about salvation. This is about a new church. It was an invitation. Maybe the evangelicalism that we used to have before it became corrupted these days with the radical right wing and Christian nationalism. So it was a gospel message. It was an invitation to a new life, both individually and in community. This was to be new. And Zwingli preached it and taught it ever since 1522. So that's what I mean by evangelical. Does that help?
Yes.
Okay. Other comments?
So
Yes.
Benedictine beliefs that you said is that, I can't pronounce that.
Schleitheim?
Yeah.
Yes.
And the 7, the 3 B's and the 3.
Two, three S's, and then O, finally, yeah.
So what about today? Bring that to today, our Anabaptist.
We don't like to draw the lines so clearly and so cleanly. Some other Anabaptists didn't either, especially the Dutch and North German Mennonites. Their confessions, their agreements, were not nearly so defined. There was more room, there was more flexibility, even to serve the government, they said in the Netherlands. So for Schleitheim, and they criticized the Swiss Anabaptists for being too legalistic. You draw the line too clearly. It's just not right. There's more breadth to the story. There's more breadth to our call to follow Christ. But the Swiss drew it very clearly and cleanly in 7 articles.
I was going to ask the same question about what Schleitheim might look like if it were done today.
Well, let's talk about baptism to begin with. Baptism was a memorial to Christ's death and resurrection, but also unity in the congregation. So still today, some congregations, if there's turmoil, will not hold the Lord's Supper, will not have communion until that's settled, because it's also a testimony to the unity. So how does that look today? Is there any conflict that would prevent us from serving the Lord's Supper? Bread, of course, we use the bread. There were many pictured symbols of the bread from the early apostles or from the church fathers. It's the individual is ground into a community as the grains are ground into flour to make bread. So, how to hold communion and what did it mean? And do we take an inventory? Do we ask people if they are committed to this congregation? Well, no, we don't. Then comes the bigger question, the ban. Is there anything you could do in your church to be given the ban, to be excommunicated? It's really in response to broken covenants. If you broke the covenant, would you expect congregational discipline or correction? Now remember, for those who think this was so harsh, then of course, the other issue that goes with it is the miting, the social avoidance, the shunning. Remember that the Catholic Church and the Reformed Church used execution to discipline their members. Well, if the Anabaptists were going to do that, they would just recognize their broken vows and let them go. Simple as that. So that's, and I don't think any of you answered what you would have to do to be banned in your congregation.
In the same way that they're talking about a reconciliation with the church in Lawrence, with the pastor who was let go from his position in the 80s for coming out as gay. I think that's an example within the last 4 decades of the church setting a line and saying, you've stepped over this and we can no longer continue the relationship.
Yes. And recently there was a different kind of a ceremony, right? Asking for forgiveness. These many decades later, the church is at a different place, which is always the case with confessions of faith too. So the 1995 confession in a Mennonite perspective, we have these articles. Some of you probably were involved in conversation about what should go into these articles. So now that we have it, is this a red line? Or does the church move and reshape itself as it understands more about life and society? So, if we come up with a new confession of faith, how will it look? Will it reflect the church now, as the 1995 statement did then? That's where the church was. Is that where the church has to stay? Well, those of us on the progressive side say, no, the church changes, our understanding changes, and so we also change our beliefs, our confessions. Let's see, separation. How are we doing with separation? Again, the Zurich Anabaptists created a very clean, thin line. You're either in one or the other. You can't be both. There is no gray area between church and world. Well, the Dutch were more comfortable with some gray areas. In some ways it didn't help because they had just as many fights as anybody else did. In fact, this is a great story. You know about the Flemish and the Frisians? The Frisians were from Menno Simon's country. The Flemish were from Belgium. And they tried to merge sometimes. And they had all kinds of conversations about uniting. One time, they almost had it done. They agreed, and they knelt for prayer. During the prayer, one of the men remembered something that had not been discussed, so it was all off. That reconciliation didn't work. We can be ridiculous, can't we? Yeah. Okay, so that was separation, the sword. Where are we on that? Can a member of your church join the military? Can a member of your church carry a sidearm? How far do we take violence and nonviolence? Shepherds. We do pretty well with shepherds, although our search process sometimes takes months, even years. We don't do it immediately. A new pastor isn't appointed immediately, but we're not in the same situation. We're not in danger of disintegrating, I don't think, most of the time. And then the oath. When you are called to court testimony, do you swear on the Bible to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, or do you affirm to tell the truth? Yeah. They allow that for us. Because again, so if I don't put my hand on the Bible, I don't have to tell the truth? Is that the thing here? So putting your hand on something holy is supposed to make you holier and without sin. Okay, we've covered the 7 articles. Any final comments, questions? All right, thank you for coming.
Thank you.
You're welcome.